Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Roger. We now have time for some questions and discussion before lunch in 20-25 minutes' time. While you're gathering your thoughts, let me put a question to Roger, and then Andrew, and then we've got people holding microphones. So if you're sitting in the middle of the rows, you could maybe come to the side. So, Roger, you gave an interview to The Australian yesterday, which we'll be reading tomorrow in the newspaper, and you touched on something that Andrew spoke about, which is the censure of civil society against inappropriate behaviour, unacceptable behaviour, that in fact we don't need laws, we need courtesy, we need tolerance, we need people to be polite. And the LA Clippers example and the opprobrium placed on that gentleman is an example of why we don't need laws. And you made the point that in fact civil society now has changed so much and has evaporated so much and is now so much the product of the state that the traditional restraints that civil society provided through the family and organised religion and other things largely no longer exists to promote that tolerance. Could you explore that a little?
Well, that's not working. Okay. This is a huge issue, and I don't have any real settled view on it, but it is obviously the case that when we were children, well, I mean older than you, when I was a child, we were all brought up to acknowledge that manners was the sine qua non of our membership of society, and we learnt this in family, in church and chapel, and also scouts and guides and all those little platoons that Janet referred to, and we learnt it in school, and the school was sort of continuous with our home life in that it affirmed the same values. It had basically Christian structure and the rest, and we can't deny that a lot of that has dwindled, and many children are brought up without that secure domestic background, and perhaps there's no obvious way in which they learn manners, because things like Boy Scouts and youth clubs and so on are in decline, and they're in decline partly because the state has regulated them out of existence. There has been, both consciously and unconsciously, a transfer to the state of all the socialising processes that we were lucky enough to be blessed with. And it should nevertheless be the case that it's part of the Conservative cause to make the thing go the other way, and to bring back the civilising process to the free associations of individuals, and not to let the state capture it entirely. The way in which it captures it is, of course, by making into a crime what would otherwise be an ordinary civil offence or an ordinary exercise of bad manners. And we just have to, if we don't stop this process, then of course there won't be a civil society. There'll be a kind of herd of subdued individuals, all of whom are frightened of stepping out of line, and a big brother who is observing them and making sure they don't step out of line. And that was the situation that Orwell predicted in 1984, towards which we are inevitably inclining if we don't do anything about it.
Andrew?
Can I just set on?
No, take mine.
Can I just first...
That's on.
Can I just first apologise? I was so nervous about sitting an exam in front of someone whose works I admire and have been reading non-stop for a month since I've known that he was coming here, that I didn't actually do a proper vote. Thank you. It was wonderful, and I do admire you, and it was a terrific thought. Oh my God, so I'm so embarrassed about that. Can you just take it as read that I thanked you?
No, and Andrew, you were very in fact, honest about another embarrassment, which I have spoken to Andrew about on a number of occasions, which is in about 4 or 8 weeks' time. Andrew is deeply embarrassed because he hasn't quite dealt with the existential question of when Australia plays the Netherlands in the World Cup, who will he be barracking for?
Anyway, my son being here, one of my sons is here and he'll tell the other. So, no, I'm not going to confess. But gee, those lanyards, there's a very nice shade of orange, aren't they? Can I just say, Roger's right. I also worry about the communication of manners and this idea of connecting people with something bigger than themselves. Where is that done? Increasingly, of course, we don't have people being forced, whether it hurt their backside to sit there for an hour or what, to sit there on a Sunday and contemplate these very things and to be told, remember, they don't have that. And in fact, there's been a concerted effort quite often to say that there is no such higher cause or being, and I speak as a non-Christian, but there is nothing bigger than themselves. In fact, they are the biggest thing in the world, you yourself, which in one sense is true, but it's a dangerous idea to give someone who doesn't know much, but has got big muscles. But, I'm not entirely in despair because, for example, I actually have a talkback show, and I actually think it's interesting. Talkback shows strike me as one of the ways in which a common morality is asserted and debated and constantly renewed. Now, you might not actually wish that the guy at the pulpit looks like some colleagues I better not mention, but, that you would wish they had some sort of air of real moral knowledge and propriety, but that process is done. So many public debates are done through talkback. People confess on talkback. Benediction is given or people are slammed, but, morality is defined. Now, obviously, it's not central. There are all various loci of all this happening, but I think that is not actually bad. That is one civilising influence.
And is that why so many people put down talkback radio and shock jocks and the public expression of a popular view?
Well, that's without doubt. There's a feeling of threat. I mean, there's no reason. John Fane just this morning on the ABC was decrying some shock jock in Sydney. There's no threat from a shock jock in Sydney to John Fane personally, except in an affront to his beliefs and a knowledge that people are listening, probably more than listening to him, and may be influenced. But, and some of it may not be all that healthy, but at least it's being debated and people are coming together electronically, yes, or on Facebook increasingly, things like that. But there is some sense of there being a community. But whether they're all being told that there's something bigger and nobler than themselves, that is obviously...
Before questions, Roger, you were nodding.
Yeah, I was nodding.
No, in fierce agreement that popular media is a good thing.
Well, everything is tainted by original sin, popular media especially. So you have to make do with what you get. But at least I totally agree with the view that the media, as we know it now, is utterly, almost entirely in the grip of left-wing ideology, and the main purpose of those who run things like the BBC, and I suspect the ABC too, is to prevent the ordinary person from having a voice in it. So here is a chance, at least, for real opinions to be expressed.
Questions? Danielle.
Danielle Kemp, thank you very much for your presentation. And Andrew, just for you, I'm French, but if France was facing Australia, I would barrack for Australia. Because of Rod next to me. No, you spoke about the velvet restraint, and I want to make just a comment on that one. The velvet restraint in exchange, the civilizing influence that we are all hoping to see survive, can only survive if people play by the same rules. And at the moment, there's a very great difference between rules. That's number one. Our civilization certainly is in danger because it is tolerant. And tolerance at some stage, when a civilization is in doubt, tolerance becomes a danger. But there is something else as well. There's only one group in Europe and probably elsewhere in the world that dares saying it as it is. And yet, they are not the favors. They don't care about being actually pointed out for fascist or for right-wing. They are not the ones that we would normally have a dialogue with, but they are the ones who at the moment show the only courage that is being shown in society. Now, am I being extreme in this statement?
I could pretend to be Tony Jones and say I'll take that as a comment. Andrew and Roger.
You've persuaded me. If France plays Australia, I'll barrack for Australia too. Look, I don't know if there's much courage in actually wanting to go and smash stuff up. I mean, that's not courage. And when I'm saying, when I look at France, what alarms me there is that it seems to me the middle is not reflective of where most people are. So many people have split to the far left, split to the far right, and I just don't know that there's a dialogue possible there. And it just seems to me, this is a country, should, heaven forbid, things get much worse economically, and Hollande seems to be trying his best to do that. You don't know where France might end up. I mean, it's just frightening how extreme that country is. And that's what I'd like our polity to always bear in mind. And I think we got a shock with Pauline Hanson, and that started to happen, to remember who their true audience is. And it's not, a minority on the ABC. Let's get the approval of the ABC. Let's remember the broad public. And that's what's worrying me a little bit about this current government, whether it's just, strangely, losing that idea that Howard had.
Roger.
Well, yes, I think it's an extremely difficult area, but just putting aside the French example for the moment, we in Britain do have, and I think this is true of France too, we have a political class which consists of people who are more interested in maintaining office than in doing right by their country. And they don't really mind who they're in alliance with as long as the office can be maintained. And they know that the one thing that they need is the support of the media, so they speak the language of the media, not the language of the people. Every now and then there is a politician who speaks the language of the people, like Nigel Farage. And of course he's immediately marginalised by the political class, as Marine Le Pen is in France. Instead of going into alliance with such a person and bringing him back from the margins where he's probably saying provocative and unhelpful things, politicians simply want to push him further. But in doing so, they push the people further too. So what we are seeing in Europe is the emergence of a self-perpetuating political class which is afraid of nothing so much as the democratic process, and therefore leans on the European Union to protect it and give it permanent sovereignty, which is not very different from what the communists achieved in Eastern Europe. So indeed, we are in a bad way in that respect. Therefore, we need those people, however much we disapprove of what they say, those people who actually do say it as they see it. I think that on the question of tolerance, one should remember that tolerance, it doesn't mean accepting all opinions, including your own. It means accepting opinions that you don't have and that you fully disapprove of. Real tolerance is painful. And in the place of it, we have this kind of liberal nihilism, which doesn't believe anything. And I think we want to go back to real tolerance, which means allowing people to think things which are really horrific. Yeah.
Dominic, yep.
Oh, thank you both for a great dose of common sense. To Andrew, I'd just like to say make a comment. The smallest minority is the individual. And Roger, I'd like to ask you a question regarding institution of education, universities, local Melbourne University. Am I a totalitarian for wanting to rid Melbourne University of its Professor of Ethics, Peter Singer, a Greens candidate, whose belief that bestiality is okay as long as it's consensual, and teaches this with public funding?
Very interesting question. It's not totalitarian to want to get rid of him, but it depends on the method used. And I think there are ways of alerting the public to the awful things that he says and thinks, and also to the fact that there are alternative professors of ethics to this one, who might cast more credit on the university. But Singer is a genius at public relations. He's managed to, by representing himself as an outrageous figure prepared to think anything, as long as it's on the left, he has gained the support of the establishment in ways that I could never gain, so his presence there indicates just how low the university has sunk, and I think you just have to accept that. The correct response is to start more free institutions like Campion College, which are not under the control of the state and are not constructed in the way that a university is.
Neil Brown. Yep. Oh, microphone, Neil.
Thank you. Principally to Andrew Bolt, but I'd be grateful if Mr. Scruton could join in. Andrew, on the quandary that the government is faced with, or apparently thinks it's faced with, on the proposed changes to Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, I am wondering how you would feel about having a jury decide those cases, because if you bring strands together, and I agree with you, the significance of talkback radio, because it does reflect the real community opinion, put that together with Roger Scruton's notion of the importance of the common law, part of which, of course, was based on jury trial. Isn't a jury trial a better way of making judgments about the sorts of things that you were faced with in the case against you? And isn't it a better practical solution to the quandary that the government apparently feels that it's now in? And generally, what do you think about the way the proposals have been advanced for the changes to that section of the law?
You want me to endorse the Neil Brown proposal that has been advanced so spectacularly well in the pages of The Spectator, which you grace. That is a compromise you're asking me to endorse, isn't it? It's a compromise. And I'd rather go the whole hog, and knowing that it's not going to go anywhere anyway, Neil, so forget it. But if there were to be a compromise, you're asking me again, would I have fancied my chances against 6 or 12 of my peers or Morty Bromberg? Now, for reasons it is not safe to discuss, let me say your idea has great merit.
Before we'll take the next question, I'll mention to Neil and to IPA members here that, of course, the IPA's submission to the 18C inquiry is now public, and of course the IPA position, Neil, and it's wonderful you're a member of the IPA, is that if you say something insulting or offensive or humiliating, it shouldn't even be against the law, so it should go nowhere near our jury. Unfortunately, not enough of us have the resources of News Corp to defend ourselves against these claims, and Neil and I will be debating this in the pages of The Spectator, I hope, very soon. Scott.
John, David
Oh,
Van
so
Giel.
hello.
Hi.
Welcome from Queensland.
Thank you. Gentlemen, on the question of phobias, I too have been diagnosed with a range of uncontrollable psychic diseases on any
That's
matter of
because
public
you
importance.
sought political pre-selection just like Roger.
Now, the question is how to respond to that strategy of the left, not to engage your arguments, but to sideline and smear your character or your psychological coherence. Because if you are an Islamophobe or a racist, or the gentleman, Dr. Matheson's probably a misogynist for his concerns.
I was
over
called a
abortion.
fascist on Monday night on the ABC.
Or a homophobe,
yes.
a homophobe who defending a child's right where possible to a mother and a father. Now, that doesn't count because once you've been diagnosed with a condition, if you try to defend yourself and say you are not this or that, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So rhetorically, how do you get out of that ugly attack in public debate?
I think it is a very difficult question. You're absolutely right that once you've been labelled in a certain way, it is almost impossible to get rid of that label. This has been a characteristic of discourse on the left ever since Marx invented the concept of ideology. Ideology is what you have, science is what I have. And Foucault's response to any criticism was always, d'où pars-tu? Where are you coming from? That's the only thing that interests me, not the truth in what you're saying. I think one has to recognise that not that we're suffering from a disease, but they are. And they are suffering from an intellectual disease, the disease of thinking that by labelling something you refute it. We have to be more vociferous at accepting the label and saying, yes, on your understanding of this, I am a homophobe, but so is everybody who's got any good sense. And gradually make it obvious that they're not engaging in argument.
Well, don't ask me, I keep failing that test. I just think, with some of that abuse, you don't start arguing because that's exactly where they're trying to position you, whether you're a homophobe. I'm not a homophobe. Oh, you are. I just think smile and wave, moving right along. I mean, and just recognise, one of Schopenhauer's essays, I think it was called on rhetoric or something, was repackaged recently with a really catchy title, 36 Ways to Win an Argument When They're Losing, or something, to win an argument when you're losing, and number 36 is abuse. So the last of the last is the abuse. And I think most of the public that you're appealing to would understand that instinctively. If you're being abused, as long as you keep your temper, don't go down that track, smile. You're not, in the end, trying to win the argument against your interviewer. You're trying to win the argument with the viewers, and recognise that a lot of them don't share that person's prejudices. And as long as you look reasonable, you're okay.
Down the back, James.
Yeah, Matthew Maloney from Queensland as well. Thanks very much for coming all this way, gentlemen. My quick question is, as people who wish to institutionalise freedom, what do we do with people who reject it? The sorts of things that we discuss here with the application and institutionalisation of power actually matter, like when I'm the officer in charge of police in Cohen, actually matter on an everyday basis when I'm dealing with people on my front counter. So, I really don't know how to treat people who want to throw away their freedom at me.
I think the response to that is that they are free to throw it away. And that's one of the freedoms that we're protecting, as long as they don't throw away other people's freedom with it. That is the issue. Freedom is something which is an opportunity that people have. And I think it's very interesting you're in that role. Your role is to keep that opportunity open, even if you've got very few customers who want to exploit it, because the people who do exploit it are those on whom the future of society ultimately depends.
Yes, thanks very much. It's been great to hear you both this morning and very stimulating. I've just got a question for Roger about education, and you talked about some of the Roman legacy and the heritage that we have in the English-speaking world. To what extent is the task being made more difficult by the baton not being passed down at a school level in terms of curriculum and education, and what your thoughts are on private education and schools in particular in Britain?
Yeah, I think this is perhaps the most important issue of practical politics for Conservatives in the modern world. It's clear that the state takeover of education, while it was a wonderful thing when it happened in the 19th century because it made education available to everyone, opened the door to colonization of the education system by people who didn't believe in it. I say they didn't believe in what you're referring to, handing on a tradition of accumulated wisdom and knowledge. Rather, they believed in something else, which was the socialist program of engineering a new society through brainwashing the young. And I think one of the instruments that has been used is that the national curriculum and the examination system, all the things that can be used, as it were, to prevent knowledge from being passed on from generation to generation. Just to say one philosophical point, I think in the 1960s and perhaps also 50s too, there grew the prejudice in the educational world that the purpose of education is to help children. The purpose of knowledge is to give children something that they wouldn't otherwise have. And that is the inverse of the truth. The purpose of children is to help knowledge. They're there in the classroom because they can receive that thing and pass it on. This idea that you're handing on knowledge means that you've also got to discriminate between those whose heads can contain it and those whose heads can't. So you've got to have things like discrimination and exams and all the rest and streaming, and that's what you will get if you have a proper private system. It will emerge automatically. But the state system has been devoted in your country as well as mine to preventing that from happening, making sure that all the children are as equal as possible at every stage, and that knowledge, if it gets in the way, has to be sacrificed.
So, Roger, just following from that, what should the role of the government in determining a curriculum be?
I think there should be sort of overall guidelines as to what is a coherent part of the curriculum, or could be, and what couldn't be. So that I think a school entirely devoted to looking after pets, sex education, and cookery probably wouldn't be acceptable. But if you added Latin as well, you're moving in the right direction. But I think there should be as much freedom as is compatible with a sense of the continuity of the educational inheritance.
We'll have the last two questions and then lunch. So, James down the back.
Oh, well, yes. I'd like to address the question to Roger Scruton. You have written extensively about the impact of so-called postmodernism. In Australia, we have the Australia Council, which is a similar organisation to I think it's called the Arts Council of Great Britain. These have an enormous amount of influence on what type of art is produced. I'm just wondering what you think. Do you think that the government really has any business in the arts? Thank you.
Well, I think in this gathering, it's very obvious that the consensus would be no.
I would hope so. Except we do have Australia's longest serving arts minister in the audience, who is also the chairman of the IPA.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. I think it's a delicate question then. But but the obvious point to make is that when you subsidise something, you create a distortion in the natural incentives that lead people to do that thing. And the awkward thing about art, at least painting, drawing, and sculpture, is that it can be possessed. You can be rewarded for it. And so a system of subsidies tends to reward those things that the committee thinks cast credit upon it for supporting those things. All bureaucratic rewards are really rewards given by the bureaucrats to themselves. And the most important thing for a bureaucrat in the arts world is to be identified as a forward-looking original character who identifies the astonishing thing that nobody else has yet perceived. So inevitably you have a movement in this postmodern conceptualist direction. And I think that has alienated the general public from the official art culture of this country and of mine. After all, you in Australia did have a wonderful tradition of painting until it got subsidised and until it got discovered, really, by the international market. And it's probably better if it was left as it was.
Final question. Right up the back, Dom. In the middle, yep.
My name's Paul Hardiansky, and my question's to Professor Scruton, but to also to Mr. Bolt as well. T.S. Eliot once said that, I'll just read this short quotation, I'll get to the question. Half the harm that is done in this world is due to people who want to feel important. They don't mean to do any harm, but the harm does not interest them, or they do not see it, or they justify it because they are so absorbed in the endless struggle to think well of themselves. Well, I'm all sure you're probably familiar with the sort of person that is described by in this quotation, and I wonder. I think there are a lot of. I think how would you engage with people on the left who may fit this description? I'm not necessarily talking about the people who may be just concerned with power or those sort of caricatures, although I think they often may fit them. But the people who just want to think well of themselves and who mean to do good but don't really know what they do.
Well, it's very difficult to puncture the self-opinion of such people, because, as Eliot says, when they do harm, they don't notice it. And so that pointing out the consequence of their acts never has any effect. They always will attribute it to something else or someone else. And we've seen this in general with the left when it came to pointing out the consequences of the imposition of Marxism on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The response, even though my colleagues in the university went on teaching Marxism, nevertheless, they said, yes, well, that was a lot of mistakes made. We're not to blame for that. So there's a capacity, a self-important person has an automatic capacity to avoid blame. And the only thing I think that brings a self-important person down to earth is disappointment in love. And you have to find the partner with which that person falls helplessly in love, who then reveals herself or himself to be incurably right-wing.
Andrew.
Well, that quote you read out is very much in line with, I think Bertrand Russell said the same, that so much that passes for humanity is just a disguised hatred or love of power. And I think to strip that back, to expose that such humanity is about infringing on someone else's freedom, I think you need not to try to convince the unconvincible, as Roger suggests. It's really, I think you need always to remember who your audience is, and that someone's grand scheme is someone else's loss of freedom. Well, in that scenario, who do you talk to? You talk to the people who will stand to lose. You don't try to persuade the architect, I mean, they know what they're doing, or they feel the instinct so great, that totalitarian itch. They want to scratch it, but you have to say to others what they risk.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Andrew. Can I ask you to thank Roger and Andrew for a wonderful session?